In early 1944, as the Pacific War reached its boiling point, the Japanese Empire believed it still held one final, decisive card. A plan so absolute, so deeply rooted in centuries of samurai warfare, that Tokyo was certain it could bleed the Americans dry and halt their advance for good. The idea was brutally simple: build fortresses that could not be taken, garrison them with thousands of elite troops, mount colossal coastal guns in concrete and steel bunkers, force the Americans to come straight at them, and die doing it. These outer islands of the Pacific weren't just outposts. They were meant to be giant meat grinders, replicas of Tarawa, scaled up, hardened, perfected. Japan's high command convinced itself that Americans were predictable, methodical, trapped inside their own doctrine. They believed the U.S. Navy would have no choice but to batter these island citadels in a series of suicidal frontal assaults. And once the Americans hurled themselves against those walls, Japan would finally deliver the decisive blow it had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. But something was about to break. Not a fortress, not a doctrine and assumption. Because while Japan was preparing for a war of attrition, one American admiral stood over a map in Pearl Harbor, staring at the chain of islands Japan had transformed into invincible strongholds, and quietly realized that the entire strategy had a fatal flaw. A flaw so simple that once it was exploited, it would kill not only thousands of Japanese soldiers, but the very philosophy their war plan depended on. Japan's confidence in its island fortresses did not come from arrogance alone. It came from a doctrine, one that had guided the Imperial Navy for decades. They called it the Z Plan, a blueprint for a single, catastrophic showdown that would shatter the American advance in one sweeping, heroic moment. The Japanese imagined the Pacific as a giant arena. On the outer ring of that arena, they fortified islands like Jaluit and Meal, turning them into brutal replicas of Tarawa, but even deadlier. They believed that if the Americans dared to strike these strongholds, the cost in blood would be unbearable. And as those losses mounted, Japan would finally force Washington to negotiate. The plan had logic, it had history, and in the minds of its architects, it had inevitability. Admiral Monzo Akiyama, the man responsible for much of the Marshal's defense, was absolutely certain of it. To his staff he declared, "The American mind is methodical. They lack imagination. They will strike where we are strongest." And why shouldn't he believe that? Tarawa had proven the Americans would attack head-on, even into impossible positions. Every major battle so far had taught Japan the same lesson. The U.S. Navy would come straight for whatever Japan tried to protect. So the Japanese prepared for that exact attack. They filled their fortresses with ammunition, reinforced the bunkers, aligned the guns toward the open ocean. These islands became shrines to the idea of the decisive battle, unshakable, immovable, prepared to absorb anything America threw at them. But while Akiyama and his commanders placed their faith in concrete and steel, something else was happening quietly, invisibly, on the American side. U.S. Intelligence had cracked the Japanese codes. For the first time, America saw not only where Japan was strong, but exactly where it was weak. And one particular weakness, hidden behind all those fortresses, was about to expose the fatal illusion at the heart of Japan's strategy. When American intelligence finally decrypted Japan's communications, the picture that emerged was nothing like the impenetrable fortress network Tokyo believed it had built. The outer islands were indeed fortified, layered in bunkers, artillery, and elite troops, but behind that wall, at the very center of the Marshalls, lay a weakness so profound it almost seemed impossible. Kwajalein Atoll, the administrative hub, the nerve center of the entire defensive cluster. Because it sat behind the ring of invincible fortresses, Japan assumed it was safe, shielded by distance, protected by doctrine, and so Kwajalein was staffed accordingly. Out of roughly 5,000 personnel, only 1,200 were actual combat troops. The rest were radio operators, engineers, cooks, clerks, and construction workers, people essential to running the base, but never intended to face a direct assault. To Nimitz, This wasn't just a vulnerability. It was an opportunity with the potential to shatter Japan's entire strategy in a single blow. At Pearl Harbor, he gathered his commanders around a massive plotting map. The room expected the usual: Jaluit, Mila, Wacha, the fortresses Japan had worked so hard to build. Those were the targets any conventional strategist would attack. But Nimitz didn't point to them. He pointed straight through them. His finger landed on Kwajalein, an island the Japanese considered untouchable simply because they believed no American commander would dare bypass the outer ring. The room fell silent as he issued the order that would redefine the Pacific War. We are not going to Jaluit. We are not going to Mil. We are going straight to Kwajalein. It was a decision that defied every rule Japan thought the United States would follow. A move so audacious that if it worked, Japan's strongest positions would instantly become irrelevant, even dangerous to their own strategy. And to make it work, the Americans would need more than boldness. They would need deception. To strike directly at Kwajalein without first dismantling the outer fortresses, the Americans needed to pull off something extraordinary. A deception so convincing that Japan would not realize the trap until it was far too late. And so the U.S. Navy began laying the groundwork for one of the most elaborate misdirections of the Pacific War. For weeks, American carrier groups unleashed wave after wave of attacks on the fortified islands. Japan expected them to assault. Dive bombers pounded runways. Battleships hurled shells that turned beaches into plumes of smoke and shattered coral. Reconnaissance flights buzzed overhead, mapping trenches and bunkers as if preparing for a full-scale invasion. To the Japanese, it all looked perfectly familiar, perfectly predictable. Exactly what Admiral Akiyama believed the Americans must do. His staff watched the bombardments and felt vindicated. The Americans are softening the defenses, they reported with confidence. Every explosion, every shell crater, every plume of smoke seemed to prove their doctrine correct. But it was all an illusion. Behind the spectacle, the true invasion force was assembling far to the east, hidden behind layers of misdirection and timing. The Japanese commanders on the outer fortresses saw the fury of the shelling and assumed the worst, but never questioned why American troop transports weren't appearing on the horizon. Because there were none. The outer islands were being assaulted by sound and fury, but not by landing craft. Tokyo believed the Americans were doing exactly what they had predicted. In reality, the U.S. Navy was preparing to violate every assumption Japan had built its defense upon. The American fleet was about to perform a maneuver so unexpected, so far outside the doctrinal playbook, that the Japanese high command wouldn't understand it until the moment the invasion was already underway. And by then, it would be far too late. At dawn on January 30th, 1944, the Japanese commanders on Kwajalein stepped out of their bunkers, expecting another day of distant bombardment. They were confident. The outer fortresses were taking the hits, exactly as planned. The decisive battle, the one they had spent years preparing for, felt inevitable. Then they looked toward the horizon, and everything they believed about the war collapsed in an instant. The horizon wasn't empty. It was crowded thick with the silhouettes of warships so vast and so numerous that for a moment officers simply stared in disbelief. 7 battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, cruisers and destroyers in serried ranks, and behind them, hundreds of transports carrying nearly 40,000 American troops, not outside the fortress ring, not advancing on Jaluit or Mil. Inside the lagoon, inside the shield Japan thought was impenetrable. The Americans hadn't assaulted the outer islands. They had sailed right past them, slipping through the gaps Japan never imagined anyone would exploit. The guns that Japan had spent months burying in concrete guns angled toward the ocean were suddenly pointed the wrong way. Useless. In his underground bunker, Admiral Monzo Akiyama watched the impossible unfold. Shells from the USS New Mexico and USS Mississippi began hammering his headquarters. Walls of reinforced concrete crumbled like wet sand. Communications broke apart. Bunkers he had inspected personally were flattened in seconds. Akiyama's staff shouted for orders. But the admiral, a man trained his entire life for the decisive battle, understood the truth faster than any of them. Their doctrine had failed. Their assumptions had shattered. The enemy had come from a direction their entire strategy declared impossible. Akiyama scribbled one final line into his diary, a quiet confession buried under the thunder of American battleships. The enemy does not honor the rules. They fight a different war. On the beaches, Marines began loading into their landing craft. Above them, carrier aircraft darkened the sky. The battle for Kwajalein, the heart of Japan's marshal's defense, was about to begin. And unlike the outer fortresses, this island was never built to endure a direct hit. The assault on Kwajalein did not begin with infantry or landing craft. It began with obliteration. As the first American shells screamed overhead, the island seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the bombardment. The battleships, New Mexico and Mississippi, fired in murderous rhythm, their 14-inch guns belching fire that rolled across the lagoon like thunder trapped in a steel cage. Every impact sent geysers of earth, coral, and smoke clawing into the sky. Kwajalein's landscape, the ridgelines, the groves of palm trees, the paths carved by decades of island life, began to vanish. Not collapse, not crumble, vanish. Trees were shredded into splinters so fine they drifted like ash. Bunkers Japan had boasted about, bunkers poured in layers of reinforced concrete, cracked open like eggs dropped from a rooftop. Gun pits were swallowed whole. Communication trenches became rivers of dust. And then the Marines came. They hit the beaches in waves, fanning out across a shoreline that no longer resembled the maps they had studied. The island had been pounded so brutally that even veteran officers struggled to recognize landmarks. The ground was hot. The air tasted of gunpowder and salt. The smoke never stopped moving. Resistance was fierce but fractured. The defenders on Kwajalein were not the elite troops stationed on the outer fortresses. Many were cooks, clerks, mechanics, construction laborers, men who had never expected to shoulder rifles against a full-scale American invasion. Still, they fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who knew there would be no reinforcements, no retreat, no second chance. They launched banzai charges over broken terrain. They fired from collapsed bunkers, half buried in rubble. Some took positions inside ruined buildings where the walls shook like paper with every American shell. But courage could not compensate for the imbalance of power. American Sherman tanks rolled through the shattered tree lines, their treads grinding over debris as if plowing a field. Flamethrower teams advanced behind them, sweeping bunkers and crawl spaces with jets of fire so bright they stained the smoke orange. Machine gun nests that had been silent under bombardment now opened fire, only to be eliminated within seconds. Every hour pushed the Japanese defenders further into chaos. By the second day, large pockets of resistance were gone. By the third, Japanese commanders were dead or cut off. By the fourth, the battle was no longer a battle. It was a demolition. When the shooting stopped, nearly 8,500 Japanese defenders lay dead. Fewer than 400 Americans had fallen. And the most devastating truth was this: Japan had not lost because Kwajalein was weak. They had lost because the entire foundation of their strategy had been built on assumptions the Americans refused to follow. As Marines secured the atoll, they quickly realized something chilling. The real consequences of Nimitz's plan were only beginning to unfold, because the islands Japan expected Americans to attack were still fully manned, and they had been left utterly alone. While American flags were being raised over the ruins of Kwajalein, thousands of Japanese soldiers on the fortress islands of Jaluit, Mile, and Wache stood ready for the battle they believed was inevitable. They waited in bunkers carved from concrete. They manned artillery positions facing the sea. They checked ammunition, rehearsed defensive drills, tightened uniforms, sharpened bayonets. Every man was prepared to die where he stood. What none of them understood was that the battle had already passed them by. They watched the horizon for the dark shapes of American transports. They listened for the thunder of naval guns drawing closer. They scanned the beaches for the first wave of landing craft. Nothing came. Instead, they saw something far worse. American convoys, columns of ships so large they stretched across the lagoon, sailed past them. Not toward them, past them. Always just outside the reach of their guns, close enough to see, too far to hit. At first, Japanese commanders assumed this was temporary, a feint, a probe, a prelude to invasion. But the ships never turned. Days became weeks. Weeks bled into months. And slowly, a horrifying truth settled over the garrisons. They had not been defeated. They had been abandoned, cut off, ignored, left to wither. Their supply lines crumbled one by one. No fresh ammunition, no food, no medicine, no orders from high command. Tokyo had nothing left to send and no way to send it. Inside the bunke, rice rations dwindled to spoonfuls. Men who had once trained for glorious sacrifice now hunted for insects, boiled weeds, scraped mold from bamboo. Some collapsed in their posts, too weak to stand but still clutching rifles that would never be fired. Elite soldiers chosen for their strength and discipline became gaunt silhouettes in crumbling uniforms. Yet discipline remained. They kept watch. They patrolled empty beaches. They stood at attention when officers passed, even as their bodies trembled from hunger. The fortresses Japan once celebrated as invincible had become open-air prisons, holding men who were supposed to die fighting but instead were dying by inches, unseen by the enemy they had been trained to destroy. A few officers recorded their final thoughts in letters that would never leave the islands. "We stand here waiting for a battle that will not come. The Emperor prepared us to die as warriors, not to vanish like ghosts." The tragedy was not just physical, it was psychological. Japan had built these fortresses to shape the battlefield. Now they shaped nothing. They protected nothing. They existed only as monuments to a doctrine that had collapsed the moment the American fleet sailed past them. By the end of 1944, many of these garrisons were shadows, not armies. Thousands of men starved to death on beaches no one wanted. Thousands more were too weak to lift their weapons. Japan had prepared them to fight to the last breath, but the Americans had taken away the battle itself. And for a soldier raised in the code of decisive war, there could be no worse fate. By the time Kwajalein fell silent and the ghost garrisons of the outer islands sank into starvation and despair, something far larger than a battle had ended. An era had died. For decades, military theorists around the world believed in the power of the fortress, the immovable citadel, the concrete shield, the fixed strong point that could grind any attacker to dust. From European coastal guns to Pacific island bunkers, nations poured their faith, their steel, and their soldiers into walls they believed could not be broken. Kwajalein shattered that belief. Japan had built a chain of invincible island bastions, expecting the Americans to hurl themselves against those walls, just as they had at Tarawa. They imagined a grand, decisive showdown, a test of will, blood, and endurance. They thought they understood the rhythm of the war. But the Americans refused to play their part in that script. Instead of smashing the fortresses, they walked around them. Instead of honoring the rules of the decisive battle, they rewrote the entire game. And instead of feeding thousands of Marines into concrete death traps, they turned those traps into cages, cutting off every fortress from behind until they collapsed under their own weight. Fortress warfare depended on one thing: the belief that the enemy had no choice but to attack. Nimitz destroyed that belief with a single decision. When the U.S. bypassed the outer islands, they exposed the fatal flaw in Japan's strategy, a flaw born not from weakness, but from certainty. Japan had assumed the Americans would always behave the same way, follow the same logic, respect the same doctrine. But wars are not won by honoring the enemy's expectations. Wars are won by breaking them. Kwajalein did not simply tip the balance of power in the Pacific. It signaled the birth of maneuver warfare, the idea that mobility, intelligence, and unpredictability could shatter even the strongest walls. And on those abandoned islands, among the bunkers that never fired, the guns that never turned, the soldiers who waited for a battle that never came, the age of the fortress breathed its last. Kwajalein was more than a victory, it was a revelation. In just 4 days, the U.S. Navy exposed the limits of static power and the danger of relying on assumptions that no longer belong on the battlefield. Japan built fortresses to shape the war, but in the end, the war reshaped them. Thousands of soldiers waited for an assault that would never come, trapped not by American fire, but by a strategy that had collapsed beneath their feet. The lesson whispered through the ruins of the marshals is as old as warfare itself. Strength means nothing when it cannot move. and a fortress is only as powerful as the imagination of the commander behind it. Admiral Nimitz understood that. Japan didn't, and history remembers the difference. If you found this story interesting, you'll want to explore more untold chapters of World War II, the decisions, the mistakes, the overlooked moments that changed everything. Subscribe to discover the next forgotten battle. Like the video to help it reach more history enthusiasts? And tell me in the comments, which Pacific War story should we cover next? The past is full of surprises. Let's uncover the next one together.